Today's story is about a young woman struggling with deep emotional trauma who suddenly finds herself in a life-or-death situation after a devastating plane crash. Trapped in the freezing mountains, she must fight nature, fear, and her own past to survive. The story begins with a young woman named Jane waking up from a disturbing nightmare linked to her painful past. She suffers from severe trauma and often struggles with dark thoughts about ending her life. Jane currently lives in a treatment facility called the Lifehouse, a rehabilitation center where people dealing with different mental health struggles receive care and support. One morning, her roommate Kara asks if Jane had another vision about her father. Kara admits she couldn't sleep because she feels sad knowing Jane will soon leave the facility. It has been a year since Jane tried to end her life, and now she is preparing to return home. The Lifehouse is a large recovery center with many facilities designed to help patients heal. Despite the support around her, Kara secretly worries that Jane might be planning something dangerous after leaving. Later, while getting ready for the day, Jane is warned by a staff member to be careful while using a razor. The worker also mentions that tragedy seems to run in Jane's family. However, Jane quietly admits that deep inside, she still hopes to be saved and loved. At the swimming pool, Jane meets a new patient whose body carries severe burn scars. The two begin to connect while talking about the painful experiences that brought them to the center. That night, Jane secretly leaves her room. After living there for a long time, she has learned many things about the building, including how to access the pharmacy. She quietly enters the room and collects several pills before quickly leaving when she hears someone approaching. The next morning, during group therapy, a boy named Phil talks about how he harms himself. He explains that long ago doctors believed cutting a patient could release illness from the body. In his mind, hurting himself was his way of trying to remove the pain inside him. Later, Jane is invited to speak at an event held at the Lifehouse. She explains that she is someone who always plans everything carefully and feels anxious when she doesn't know what will happen next. She also reveals that her family has a tragic history. Both her father and her grandmother died by suicide. Jane confesses something shocking. She says that when she boards her flight home later that night, she believes only her body will arrive, not her spirit. However, it turns out that Jane had briefly fallen asleep during her speech. When asked again, she simply thanks everyone for supporting her, but admits that she never wants to return to the Lifehouse again. Later, Jane speaks to her mother on the phone. Her mother excitedly talks about picking her up from the airport and spending time together. But overwhelmed by guilt, Jane pretends to have a breakdown and suddenly ends the call. Deep down, Jane struggles with mixed emotions. She once hated her father for leaving her behind, believing he abandoned the family. But now she feels guilty because she is planning to do the same thing to her own mother. Even though she never understood why her father ended his life, the pain of losing him destroyed her happiness. Now she believes she finally understands his suffering and even finds herself forgiving him. Soon after, Jane packs her bags and heads to the airport. Meanwhile, Kara becomes suspicious and rushes to inform the doctor that Jane may be planning to harm herself. At the airport, Jane receives a call from the Lifehouse but decides to ignore it. While waiting, she meets a cheerful woman named Margaret who excitedly talks about her engagement and upcoming marriage. At the same time, a friendly man named Paul struggles to pass through airport security, and Jane's unusual behavior catches his attention. Breathing nervously, Jane receives another call from the Lifehouse. When the doctor confronts her about Kara's concerns, Jane quickly flips the situation and claims that Kara is lying and often makes things up. Back at the facility, hearing this accusation pushes Kara into an emotional breakdown as she begins throwing things in anger and pain. Meanwhile, Jane is left alone with the heavy realization of how deeply she has hurt the one friend who truly cared about her. A little while later, Jane accidentally walks into the wrong restroom on the plane. Moments after she steps inside, Paul knocks on the door and gently informs her that she's actually in the men's restroom. Trying to lighten the moment, he jokingly offers to stay and keep her company, but Jane politely declines. When she comes back out, Paul checks on her, sensing that something isn't right. He tries to start a conversation and offers to sit with her for a while. Jane thanks him for being kind, but quietly walks away. Still, Paul doesn't completely disappear. Soon the two exchange their names and briefly talk. Once the passengers board the plane, Jane is surprised to discover that she and Paul have seats right next to each other. Paul is friendly and talkative, while Jane mostly stays quiet and lost in her thoughts. Later, while Paul is asleep, Jane writes a short note. In the message, she tells him that whatever happens isn't his fault and that she's grateful he was the last person she spoke to. She carefully folds the note and slips it into his pocket. After that, Jane quietly gets up and heads toward the airplane bathroom. On the way, she accidentally bumps into another passenger. Once inside the restroom, she pulls out several bottles filled with pills. For a moment, she stares at them, deciding whether she should go through with her plan. Just then, the plane suddenly shakes with turbulence. The violent movement knocks the bottles from her hands, scattering the pills across the floor. As she rushes to pick them up, a flight attendant starts knocking on the door, telling her to return to her seat immediately. Within seconds, the situation grows far worse. The turbulence becomes extremely violent, and the plane begins to shake uncontrollably. Passengers panic as the aircraft is thrown around in the air. Screams fill the cabin as everyone braces for the worst. Then, the unimaginable happens. The plane crashes into a remote mountain range covered in deep snow. Wreckage and debris are scattered across the frozen landscape. Jane slowly regains consciousness, injured and disoriented. As she looks around, she realizes that many passengers did not survive the crash. Among them is Margaret, the excited woman who had been proudly showing off her engagement ring earlier. She dies right in front of Jane's eyes, terrified and surrounded by devastation. Jane desperately calls out for help, but the mountain is silent. While searching through the wreckage, she eventually finds Paul trapped beneath debris. Despite her injuries, Jane manages to free him. Both of them are hurt, but they quickly realize that surviving the freezing wilderness is now their biggest challenge. Together, they gather whatever supplies they can find from the wreckage and temporarily take shelter. Eventually, they climb back inside a section of the crashed plane. It becomes clear that Paul may have broken several ribs. As the freezing night approaches, the two share a sleeping bag to stay warm. They carefully check the supplies they manage to save. Their small stash includes a few snacks like peanuts and pretzels, some energy bars, water, gloves, a flashlight, and a Swiss Army knife. The next morning, Jane tries to leave the wreckage, but the door is stuck. After forcing it open, she rushes outside and begins digging through the snow, trying to pull Margaret's body from the frozen ground. Paul follows her and gently asks if she knew the woman. Overwhelmed with guilt, Jane breaks down in tears. She believes she should have been the one who died instead. In her pain, she tells Paul to leave her behind on the mountain and try to escape on his own. But Paul refuses to abandon her. No matter how difficult things become, he insists that the only way they will survive is by staying together. Paul eventually helps Jane back into the broken airplane so she can warm up, but the frustration of their situation overwhelms him, and he shouts into the cold wilderness. While sitting alone inside the wreckage, Jane notices one of her pill bottles among the debris. Nearby, she also finds a sharp shard of broken glass. Quietly, she keeps both items to herself. After a short time, Paul returns and tells Jane they cannot stay there any longer. A storm is approaching, and the crashed plane leaves them completely exposed to the freezing weather. He explains that rescue teams might take weeks to find them, so they must start moving toward the mountains if they want any chance of survival. But Jane has already lost hope. She tells Paul he should leave without her because she has accepted the idea of dying on that mountain. Paul refuses to listen, determined to keep them both alive. He forces Jane to gather her belongings and threatens to take the only sleeping bag if she refuses to come. Jane still insists he should go alone, but when Paul finally begins walking away, the reality of being left completely alone suddenly terrifies her. She quickly follows him through the snow and apologizes for the way she behaved. The two survivors continue walking across the frozen mountain landscape for miles. Eventually, they reach a steep drop where the path suddenly ends. Paul explains that the only way forward is to climb down into the valley below. Jane hesitates, afraid of the dangerous descent. Paul sarcastically points out that someone who wants to die shouldn't be afraid of a little risk. He reminds her that if they stay where they are, the cold will eventually kill them. With no other choice, Jane follows him, carefully supporting each other. They slowly climb down the icy slope. At one point, they reach a narrow ledge barely wide enough to stand on. Paul manages to cross first, but Jane freezes in fear. Encouraged by Paul, she gathers the courage to step forward, grabs his hand, and finally makes it across. However, they soon realize the path ends again. With no other option left, Paul suddenly jumps off the cliff into the snow below and shouts for Jane to follow. After seeing that he survived the fall, Jane takes the leap as well and lands beside him. But during the jump, one of her pill bottles slips from her pocket. When Paul notices it, he confronts her about it. Jane admits that the pills were meant to be her escape if things became too unbearable. Realizing the danger, Paul takes the pills away from her. Exhausted from hours of walking, Jane asks for a break, but Paul insists they must keep moving. Just when things seem manageable, disaster strikes again. A powerful avalanche suddenly crashes down the mountain, burying Jane under thick snow. Desperate and terrified, Paul digs frantically until he finally manages to pull her out. He then drags her to a nearby cave where they can hide from the freezing wind. Time passes quickly, and darkness soon falls across the mountains. After several hours, Jane slowly regains consciousness. The two survivors spend the night inside the cave, trying to stay warm and alert. During the quiet night, Paul reveals something surprising. He had actually switched his airplane seat on purpose so he could sit beside her earlier. Hearing this brings a small smile to Jane's face. For the first time, she begins sharing memories from her childhood. She tells Paul how much she loved Christmas mornings when she was little. She would wake up early, sneak downstairs, and excitedly open her gifts, completely believing they were from Santa. But one Christmas morning changed everything. That day she woke up to the sound of a gunshot coming from her father's room. When she ran to check, she discovered that he had taken his own life. Paul gently suggests that despite that tragedy, Jane must still have some happy memories of her father. After thinking for a moment, Jane admits that she does. Her father used to lovingly call her Pumpkin, and she still misses hearing that nickname. She then shows Paul an old pocket watch her father gave her the night before he died. Paul explains that sometimes one terrible memory can become so heavy that it hides all the good ones. Jane admits she still feels anger toward her father for leaving her, but at the same time, she also blames herself. Paul quickly reminds her that she was only a child and could never have stopped what happened. Later that night, as the cold wind echoes through the cave, Jane holds the sharp piece of glass she found earlier. For a moment, she faces the same dark thoughts that once controlled her. But now, something has changed. The glass that once seemed like a way to end everything is now just a broken piece of glass, nothing more. And for the first time, Jane begins to question whether she might actually want to keep fighting to survive. The following morning, inside the cave, Paul wakes up in terrible pain. His broken ribs make every breath difficult, and the freezing cold has turned parts of his skin purple. He is so weak that even standing becomes a struggle. Seeing how badly he is suffering, Jane decides they should stay inside the cave for another day so Paul can regain some strength. Shivering and exhausted, Paul asks Jane if she still has the pills they saved earlier, the ones that could end their suffering if things became too unbearable. Jane still carries them, but something inside her has changed. After everything they have gone through, she no longer wants an easy escape. Paul then opens up about a painful memory from his childhood. When he was only 9 years old, his mother was dying, yet he was told he wasn't allowed to cry. The memory left him angry and confused for years. Now, lying there in pain, Paul begins to lose hope. He believes leaving the crash site might have been a terrible mistake because rescuers would probably search around the wreckage, not a hidden cave deep in the mountains. But Jane refuses to give up, looking directly at him. She tells Paul that they will survive and find a way out. Her determination and confidence slowly bring hope back to him. Encouraged by her strength, Paul gathers the courage to keep fighting. In an emotional moment, the two share a quiet hug, both realizing how much they now depend on each other. The next morning, despite the overwhelming odds, they begin moving again. After resting briefly, they continue their journey, hoping they are getting closer to a river that might lead them to civilization. But while walking across the icy terrain, Paul suddenly slips, losing his balance. He tumbles down a steep slope and crashes violently below. Jane rushes down in panic and finds him lying on the ground with a severely injured arm. Through the pain, Paul asks Jane to find a stick so they can stabilize the broken bones. As he cries out in agony, Jane quickly removes part of his jacket and uses the stick to create a splint, tightly securing his arm so it won't move further. To help ease his suffering, she gives him a few sleeping pills so he can rest. Later that night, they stop again to regain strength. Jane comforts Paul, telling him they will make it through this nightmare. But the following morning, Paul looks much worse. His body is weak and fragile, and soon he begins coughing and vomiting blood. Realizing the truth, Paul understands that he may not survive much longer. With what little strength he has left, he tells Jane that she must continue the journey alone. He insists that she has to stay alive, even if it means leaving him behind. Jane refuses at first, but after Paul repeatedly convinces her, she finally agrees. Before leaving, she hands him the bottle of sleeping pills and gently tells him to take them if the pain becomes unbearable. Jane kisses him on the forehead, and the two say goodbye. Alone once again, Jane pushes forward through the frozen wilderness. She walks for hours through snow and forest, fighting exhaustion and the brutal cold. Suddenly, a wolf appears in the distance. The animal begins chasing her, forcing Jane to run for her life. In a desperate attempt to escape, she climbs up a nearby tree and waves a stick to scare the wolf away. For a moment, it works. But when she tries to continue her journey, the wolf returns and begins stalking her again. Realizing she doesn't have the strength to outrun it anymore, Jane prepares to face the animal directly. She wraps her jacket tightly around her forearm to protect herself and waits as the wolf charges toward her. When the animal leaps, it grabs onto her covered arm. At that exact moment, Jane pulls out the sharp piece of glass she has been carrying since the crash. Using every ounce of strength she has left, she repeatedly strikes the wolf until it finally collapses. The fight leaves Jane badly wounded, but she manages to survive. Exhausted and bleeding, she stands there realizing she has just done something she once believed was impossible. For the first time, Jane truly feels the powerful instinct to live, despite her injuries and extreme exhaustion. Jane gathers the strength to keep moving forward, determined to survive. She pushes through the freezing forest and eventually reaches a river, carefully crossing it as she continues her desperate journey. After hours of struggling through the wilderness, she finally emerges from the trees and spots a road in the distance. But just before she can reach it, the pain and exhaustion become too much. Her body finally gives out, and she collapses on the ground. As she loses consciousness, Jane calls out for Paul, her voice filled with emotion. In that moment, memories from her childhood begin flashing through her mind. Moments when she was happy with her father, before tragedy changed her life. Through these memories, Jane begins to understand and accept the pain she has carried for so many years. For the first time, she feels a sense of peace and closure, allowing herself to imagine a future beyond the trauma. The story then shifts to a hospital in Montana, where Jane slowly wakes up in a hospital bed. Her mother is sitting beside her, relieved that she survived the ordeal. She tells Jane that rescuers eventually discovered Paul the day after they found her. Sadly, he did not survive. However, before his death, Paul left behind a small note. In it, he wrote about how grateful he was for their friendship and how the time they spent together meant more to him than she could ever know. And with that bittersweet message, Jane realizes that even in the darkest moments, human connection can give people the strength to keep living. And that's how the incredible journey of survival in Survive comes to an end. If you enjoyed this movie recap, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below to tell us your thoughts. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more amazing movie recaps like this.